Good afternoon to everyone in Europe, and a warm welcome to all participants, wherever you are, in our Zoom session and online on YouTube. Thank you so much for being with us here today to discuss China's digital Silk Road and Europe's digital decade. My name is Maaike Okono-Heijmans. I am a senior researcher at the Clingendael Institute in The Hague, and I will be your moderator in this online debate. Together with my colleague Brigitte Dekker, whom you will hear in a few minutes, I spent plenty of time this COVID year discussing all things about digital connectivity. As all of us basically went digital much of this year due to the corona crisis, which I think we can label the world's first digital pandemic. In the next hour or so, you will receive a snapshot of our findings, complemented by some reflections of some of the great European movers and shakers in this field. And we are very honored to have with us for this purpose David Ringrose of Europeans Commission DG Connect, as well as Reinhard Bütikofer, member of the European Parliament. I will, of course, introduce them in greater detail before I give them the floor in a few minutes. But let me first briefly take you through this year's journey on digital connectivity. In our endeavors at Clingendael, we first looked into the connectivity strategies digital element, of course, published in September 2018, now 2 years ago. And I think many of us agree that this is very much in need of an update. And indeed, the Commission is working towards this end. So I think our debate today will contribute also to that purpose, making it more global in scope and at the same time focusing on the Indo-Pacific. Of course, we cannot do without also discussing China's digital Silk Road, which is extremely relevant for everything that Europe does here in the internal market, but also in third countries. And finally, what are the opportunities for Europe to cooperate on the many different topics of digital connectivity with partners? For those of you who've been watching, checking EU summits with, for example, Japan, South Korea, ASEAN, you will all recognize that there's a digital or a tech element in this. And of course, last week when the Europe proposed its EU-US agenda for global change, also high tech featured big. So clearly the time is right to discuss this topic. That brings me to a few household remarks. I will soon invite each of our speakers to speak for about 7 minutes, give up some kickoff remarks. And that should allow for plenty of time also for our Q&A, to which, of course, I will invite all participants in our Zoom session to contribute. They will all be muted during the debate, but you can leave your questions in the Q&A box, and we will, well, of course, have a look at this and give you the floor. So do keep your computer, do stay to your computer, and I may ask you to pose your question directly to our speakers. Our technical host will then mute you or demute you, and you can also do this yourself. So first in line to give her kickoff remarks is Brigitte Dekker, my colleague at the Clingendael Institute. Brigitte will speak to you about China's digital Silk Road and detailing how this important element of China's Belt and Road Initiative is also in combination with China Standards 2035, pushing digital connectivity up the agenda in Europe. Brigitte joined Clingendael just a few years ago and has quickly established herself as an expert on high tech and geopolitics. She looks at the bigger picture of digital connectivity, but is at the same time looking at some very specific issues like export controls and high tech and semiconductors. Brigitte, I think you wanted to share a few slides with us, so perhaps bring those to the screen and then the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Maaike. I will first share my PowerPoint. Let's see. Yes, if I'm right, you can all see my PowerPoint now. So yeah, thank you. And of course, thank you for having me. We have worked hard on the papers covering the digital domain, and I think it's a subject that has become increasingly interesting during this quite bizarre year, as you said. I will try to keep it short so we have plenty of time for debate left. I'm really interested in the questions that are going to be posed by the Zoom participants. And while the title of the seminar is called Europe's Digital Decade, I would first like to take a step back and talk a bit about the reason why and how we came to the final report on the EU's effort in the digital domain. When talking and discussing the EU's digital efforts and doing research into the topic, we felt that there was not yet enough information on why the EU is suddenly stepping up its game, and also what the digital alternatives are, especially the concepts, ideas, and activities of the digital Silk Road, the digital subset of the Belt and Road Initiative were quite unknown. And to contribute to a better understanding of China's digital Silk Road and its implications for Europe especially, we started with a report on precisely that topic in the beginning of 2020. Also in 2020, we saw the US-China trade war evolve really into a conflict mostly focused on technology. Starting with the Huawei debate already in 2019, and for a large part still in 2020, digital sovereignty, individual privacy, a data-driven society, and free flows of data, but also decoupling and the intended US ban on several Chinese applications were added to the digital debate, also in the context of COVID-19. And eventually, if you look at those debates in the various different digital domains, all these debates can be traced back to digital norms and standards. At least that is how we feel it. This is a difficult area, as those norms and standards did not and still oftentimes do not yet exist. Next slide. Yes. In the whole digital domain, well, the debate is still mainly about the underlying trade-offs between privacy, business interest, and national security. While all regulations are a combination of those three, the United States has taken the path of prioritizing the interest of business. This is seen, for example, in a strong focus on free data flows, both personal and non-personal, to strengthen companies' competitive advantage by collecting and using data to develop themselves. China's approach, by contrast, strongly focuses on state security. Chinese businesses are supported and leveraged to preempt threats, and this shows in its strict data localization requirements to prevent any data from being stored outside its borders, and a mandatory security assessment for cross-border transfers. Well, those are two sides of the triangle, and the European Union represents a third way, emphasizing individuals' privacy and a human-centered approach that really puts people first and includes a strong focus on ethics, including in data protection regulations, of course, with the all-known GDPR. And secondly, the standards. The Chinese government is now rolling out Chinese Standards 2035 document. It complements the domestic economic development strategy known as Made in China 2025, and it is a blueprint that aspires to set global standards for the next generation of technologies, such as 5G, AI, and the Internet of Things. Together with the digital Silk Road, the Chinese government is thus combining this domestic push to export Chinese technologies with assertive industrial policies, with a broader agenda to enhance interoperability and compatibility between Chinese and overseas technologies, of course on Chinese terms. The Chinese, but also the US approach, thus creates a conflict with Europe's vision on the Internet. The promotion of the Chinese approach, together with norms and technical standards that are underlying under this, in multilateral organizations has also created more attention for debate within Europe. As a self-proclaimed global regulatory power, Europe is now facing a technologically advanced competitor in the regulatory organizations, such as the ITU, the lack of a strong transatlantic partnership on regulation, as those is oftentimes lacking, as the US prefers an open internet with limited regulation, at least in the eyes of the European Union. And this makes it one of the first topics the EU really must manage on its own terms. Perhaps to close, a few words about the EU, as I believe one of the most important lessons learned is that the EU has to participate in order to write the rules of the game. China's increased presence in the infrastructure, business, and regulatory domain will create challenges for the EU and its member states on the economic and security front. The EU now must climb up from being the playground of the US-China rivalry to really a decent player in the game. This does include pushing back On the one side, against the capitalist-driven digital monopolies of the US technology firms, and the state-driven, strategically organized digital Silk Road of the Chinese government, and push forward its human-centered approach that puts people first. Yeah, for now, you see here on the PowerPoint the main items of the digital Silk Road and the ones of the EU to really have a comparison of those, and they are quite similar in that respect. So we will come across each other. But for now, I will stop here, especially as our recommendations for the EU on how to move forward, as written in our report, Europe's Digital Decade, our last report, will, I think, be perfectly discussed by David Ringrose and Reinhard Bütikofer, who are both within the Brussels bubble instead of analyzing it from the outside. So thank you, and yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Brigitte, for setting the scene and for calling the attention to the different approaches, of course, of the Chinese digital Silk Road embodies, and also to the standardization and norm-setting power, I think, that we see coming from this. Then let's turn to our second speaker, David Ringrose, who will reflect on Europe's digital decade from the more technical perspective, discussing various subsets. There are, of course, many of digital connectivity from an EU perspective. I cannot think of a better person to do this. Thank you so much for being here, David. You are, of course, the head of international affairs units at the Digital Ministry, we might call it, of the European Commission, DG Connect. You're responsible for coordinating the outreach of this DG on all international issues, including the regulatory and policy dialogues with partners around the world. So there's much to say, I'm sure, also of what Europe is already doing with other partners, and perhaps where we can still improve or do better. David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Maaike. Thanks very much, Brigitte, and thanks to Clingendael for all the great work you're doing on this area. I think it's really helpful when things are changing very quickly, when there's a lot happening, to have good expert input on all of these issues, and your reports are really helpful in that. So thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to talk today and to share a panel with Reinhard, who's also been doing great work on this issue. So I'll run through basically what we're doing at the moment, what we're planning more or less for our digital decade, and then say a few words about the external part, but I won't say too much about that because I think we can discuss that afterwards. So of course, as you said, I think COVID has made us realize that the digital economy is an essential part of the resilience of our societies, and we have to review how we're doing things in order to ensure that we can protect our economies, protect our societies, and so on. And then the other big issue, of course, is the geopolitical issues that you talk so eloquently about in your reports, and where the EU has to be able to make its own choices, its own technological choices, and its own choices about how it runs its economy and society. So we're doing that in a number of ways. The first, of course, is we're putting in place a toolbox of measures to define and defend our digital economy and society. And there, as you know very well, we're talking about the foreign direct investment screening and all that type of thing to ensure that we can ensure there's a level playing field in our digital economy in Europe. But of course, making the rules isn't enough. If we're going to decide what technological choices we make, we also need to ensure that we have adequate capacities in Europe, so that we're not overly vulnerable on any one supplier, any one technology, and so on. So what are we doing? Well, the first thing that you need to do before you act in this area, we need resources. And I think one of the conclusions of this year is that as digital has made its way to the top position alongside climate change on the political agenda, the resources have followed. The Next Generation EU gives us an overall budget for the next MFF of 1.8 trillion euros. And obviously, once this is all agreed relatively soon, we should have a significant amount of resources for digital. One of the newest parts of that is the Digital Economy, Digital Europe program. And this is a new tool that we put in place specifically to move from the traditional research area to deployment. And this will be funding activities in the next few years on high performance computing, on artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, cyber centers of excellence, and so on, skills, advanced skills on AI and all that type of thing, and working with industry, boosting industry's capacity. So the Digital Europe program is tailor-made for deploying new digital solutions in Europe. There'll be another 2 billion euros or so from the Connecting Europe facility to ensure that we can be connected within the EU. So we recently had a plan on connectivity for 5G within the EU, and moving forward to 6G, developing 5G corridors and so on around Europe. We'll be continuing to put digital at the heart of the Horizon Europe program once it's agreed. So there'll be significant funding for research and innovation on digital. But of course, the big innovation this year was the 750 billion euros from the recovery plan. And we were very happy, of course, that 37% of that was going to go to the EU's #1 priority, to fighting climate change. But of course, when the European Council agreed on the 2nd of October that 20% of the funding would go to digital, also recognizing the twin transitions, if you like, that means that we as Connect have to work with our colleagues and to work with the member states to ensure we can spend 135 billion euros on digital under the recovery plan to ensure we can build back better in the next mandate, and that the recovery is not just under the same conditions as before, but that we can have a digital recovery in Europe. And what are we going to do with all of this? Well, the first thing that we need to do is to ensure that we have a strong European data market. So there, we're planning to put in place by the end of this year an industrial data and cloud alliance. And obviously, of course, like everything we do, we're working very closely with European industry, with all of the leading startups, innovators, companies in Europe. We're putting in place data spaces, and I think the idea to move ahead with a health data space in Europe obviously has been extremely welcome, because we saw from a very practical point of view the barriers to exchanging health data across Europe, and we can't go through those problems again. So a health data space will be an extremely significant contribution to that. But we'll also be looking at data spaces for manufacturing, mobility, and so on. And of course, part of building a data space within Europe, it's not just money, it's not just technology, it's also trust. So we adopted a paper last week on data governance, and we'll be preparing the Data Act for next year, which will ensure that data in Europe is stored in Europe according to European values and European regulations and so on. We're putting in place on cloud. We realize the dominance of basically 3 large cloud providers. And in order to ensure that companies in Europe can have a choice of cloud provider that is regulated according to European values and so on, we're putting together the Cloud Federation. We noticed, very happy to see a declaration in support of that in October from the member states. Technologically, we realize, of course, not just the EU, but many people are dependent on very few suppliers for microprocessors. So we'll be putting together what we call a project of common European interest to support the development of semiconductors in Europe. And our target there is to ensure that we can account for 20% of the semiconductor value chain around the world in the near future. And then, so that's funding. Those are projects, those are industrial projects. And you mentioned at the beginning the regulatory issues. Now, I didn't begin with the regulatory issues because we do that a lot, which perhaps is why some of our partners around the world think that all Europe does is regulate. Now, that's not the case, obviously, but regulation is an important second pillar of what we're doing. So I mentioned already the Data Act for next year. everybody's been watching as the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act come closer. They'll be here before the end of the year, 15th of December. We'll be going to adopt the Digital Services Act package, which obviously will look at the responsibilities of platforms and the impact of platforms on the competition framework and so on. We'll be looking also at a review of the Network and Information Security Directive and looking to develop European capacities in cyber. And then next year as well, looking at the regulatory framework for artificial intelligence. And this obviously will be a framework that aims to encourage innovation, but to ensure, of course, that people can trust artificial intelligence as it comes closer and closer to our lives in many areas, whether it's in health, insurance, finance, or whatever. So I think it's very clear that this year has been a difficult year, but we made a huge progress in the EU in terms of rolling out our plans in securing resources for this. Next year is going to be, we're beginning already a year of implementation. And as the President of the European Commission said in her State of the Union, we're beginning a digital decade. Next year, we'll be coming out with what we call a digital compass. This will basically be the way ahead, how we're going to structure all of these things that I talked about, what the targets are going to be, and so on. So this is, I think, a clear demonstration that the EU as a whole has understood what the digital transformation means. We're putting the resources behind it. We're working together, all the institutions and the member states and European industry, to try to ensure that we can make the recovery a digital recovery. Now, obviously, a lot of this applies also to our external cooperation. And we're trying to transfer the Team Europe approach, if you like, to the way we're working in the outside world. But maybe the best introduction to that and what we need to do, how we need to change, would be to listen to Reinhard, and then I'll be very happy to complement with any other remarks on that after his presentation. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, David, for detailing not just the regulation, but I really appreciate also your discussion of the more offensive action, if you may, that the EU is also taking. The Cloud Alliance is one. Next Generation Internet Initiative, I think you didn't even mention, but it's another example of what the EU is currently also engaging in, that fewer people see. So thank you for that. In the one question that was already raised that I would like perhaps now you to take, David, is perhaps a combination of those two priorities that the von der Leyen Commission has set for itself, as you said, digital and climate. Do you think that there's any tech fields in particular promising for Europe that sort of combine those two ambitions? And the examples that was given in the Q&A was renewable energy or battery technologies. Perhaps a quick response to that? Sure.
I mean, there's already one of the projects of common European interest, IPCIs, that we've set up already this year is the Battery Alliance. This is something that Commissioner Breton put in place earlier this year to try to ensure that we can meet our needs in terms of battery technology. Now, in terms of the IT sector, it's a difficult question because, of course, the increasing digitalization of our economy means that the digital sector is becoming a bigger consumer of energy as it gets bigger. So firstly, what we need to do is to decrease the climate footprint of the energy sector, and that means the work that we're doing on, for example, low energy data centers. One part of the IPCI on semiconductors is that we're aiming to look not just at increasingly high performance semiconductors, but also low energy chips, because we want to make sure that we can produce chips which will meet the performance demands, but will also be low energy. So, but then of course we're looking at the involvement of IT in mobility, for example, smart mobility. A lot of the work that we're doing on 5G corridors is designed to ensure that we can roll out connected cars, connected vehicles, and so on, which will be far more energy efficient, and so on and so on. So there's, I agree, it's a very digital and climate are not separate in many areas, they are joined, and we work together on trying to achieve the same targets.
Thank you so much for that initial answer. Then let me give you the floor to Reinhard Bütikofer, who will reflect on this topic from a more geopolitical perspective, of course. And of course, many of you will know Reinhard, perhaps from his own work on connectivity, as the main author of this draft report for European Parliament on connectivity, which I believe will be put to vote next week, right, in the AFET committee in the European Parliament. You've been working on the topic for a long time yourself, and you have a long-standing interest, of course, also in China and specifically, but in Asia more generally. And perhaps I could mention just the fact that you're a long-time member also of the Interparliamentary Alliance for Democracy. I forget the exact name, but of course, international cooperation also to promote democracy. And on China, of course, that's what it is about. So Reinhard, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for having me. It's an honor for me to be discussing with you and Brigitte and David. Let me start from the point you just put to David, because I think that's an important point of departure. David talked about the twin transitions, and indeed we cannot, if we want to be successful, we cannot divide the digital transformation from the green transformation at all. They have to be closely intertwined. And to mention a practical example, we want to create, for instance, a carbon border adjustment mechanism. I don't see how we could do that without advanced digital technologies, without AI or blockchain technology. And on the other hand, of course, the development of digital technologies also has to take account of environmental imperatives. So that's clearly a position that we all have to take as I said, point of departure. Then I would like to address the triangle that Brigitte has described with the different priorities between the EU and the US and China. And of course, I completely agree with the work that you're doing at Clingendael to focus on a human-centered approach. I would, however, add that I don't think this is a perfect triangle between, from how I see that, the approach that you describe as typical for the United States and the approach that we're choosing over here. So the business-centered approach and the human-centered approach, they coincide in that they're both rules-based and based on models of an open society, which is something that neither shares with a Chinese approach, the state-centered approach, the Leninist approach, or the Fatya approach. Obviously, in the practical debates with our American partners, we are up against monopolistic tendencies in their approach, but I would not argue that the American model is based on a monopolistic approach, and I would even assume that we can find common cause with maybe the incoming US administration to look at new approaches to deal with competition issues. The EU has to try to engage with digital connectivity with an all of society approach. We have to bring on board not just European institutions and member states, but also business and, very importantly, civil society stakeholders. And we are obviously now ambitious enough to say we want to be a full range supplier. We don't just want to work on regulation. We also want to develop business models and have play a role in the infrastructure development. In that context, indeed, the European Connectivity Strategy of 2018, which is now getting, I would say, its second breath, has been a front runner in highlighting the role of digital connectivity, even though at the time, 2.5 years ago, it didn't get as much exposure that it clearly merits. And that is why in the new approach, digital is obviously taking much more center stage in our conversations. So clearly in the draft report that we are just working on in the Foreign Relations Committee, it is clearly spelled out in the beginning that we are driving this policy based on the European Green Deal and digital transformation as priorities. The specific dimensions of work we may look into in more detail if there are questions in that regard. But the report tries to look, as I say, into the different dimensions. Obviously, there is a dimension of national security also for us. We mentioned that in the context of 5G infrastructure, and if the Parliament would adopt the position that we propose, then it would, for instance, emphasize a policy that includes phasing out 5G technology built by third countries who do not share European values and ethical standards, which is, I think, a position that we might not have agreed upon 2.5 years ago. But today we're moving forward and seeing how important that is. And we also are urging Commission to strongly condition connectivity projects with third countries on the ethical use of technology. So clearly we are trying to project the human-centered approach also in combination with national security concerns into our external dimension of digital connectivity development. But another aspect that has already been highlighted by Brigitte and David is, of course, standardization. And there we must be aware of an increasingly sharp standards competition globally, in particular between us and China. And looking at the important role that China plays in international standardization organizations, there is no space for being lazy in that regard. Europe has been acquainted with playing and boxing above its weight in the standardization world. Indeed, based on our very effective and efficient system of creating European standards, we have had a great share in globally inclusive standardization discussions. But we are now being confronted with a two-pronged Chinese approach. On one hand, take an increasingly strong influence in standardization organizations like ITU or IETF and others. But on the other hand, they're also increasingly promoting exclusively national and nationally mandated Chinese standards to create a kind of market lock-in where they are successful. So I think that this standardization dimension is a very, very important strategic battle. And then, of course, I will stop in a minute. Then, of course, we will also have to look into some infrastructure activity, and just as one example to show that we're reaching out also beyond just the Eurasian arc. I would like to mention the Building Europe Link to Latin America cable that will probably be opened during the Portuguese presidency, first half of next year. And we strongly believe that digital connectivity partnerships should not just play a role with regard to Asian partners, where we see opportunities also to possibly create partnerships around a lighthouse project like 6G cooperation, but also to include African partners. And to end on a specific note that maybe has not been getting enough attention, but climate change is having an unexpected effect also in opening new connecting routes between Asia and Europe along the Arctic route, the east route and the west route. And China is playing very actively in that regard. China is pushing hard to be recognized as an Arctic power, even though it's not an immediate neighbor of the Arctic. And Europe cannot underestimate that dimension either. Let me stop there. Maybe we can get into more detail later.
Thanks so much, Reinhard, for elaborating on that analytical framework of the tripod, which indeed, there's no equidistance, as it has been said by External Action Service policymakers, of course, between the US and China, seen from Europe. We clearly align with the rules-based model that's still underlying the big tech prioritization of the US, and no doubt about that. There's some interesting questions following up on what you just said about cooperation with like-minded partners. Perhaps Luca Kuiper, I believe the question was yours. Would you like to take the floor and pose your question live, please? I'm hoping that he's still online and can unmute himself. Yes? Luca, you can speak now. Okay, if he's not here, then let me at least pose his question. It was basically about what can the EU do? What role is there for the EU in the various initiatives that have been proposed for multilateral cooperation? The Tech 10, for example, some have called it the D10, the Data 10. Others have called it the Global Democratic Alliance or Technology Alliance. There's many different initiatives, I think, right now proposed and perhaps underway also to enhance cooperation between like-minded countries on these topics. David, would you like to go first in addressing this question? What can the EU do? And perhaps, Reinhard, what role is there for other stakeholders also, including, of course, perhaps the Interparliamentary Alliance, but also cooperation with the private sector?
Sure. I think the answer is very simple, and you referred in the beginning to the communication that the Commission adopted just yesterday on EU-US agenda. Because if you look at that document, firstly, of course, about 25% of the words The pages are devoted to the trade and technology agenda and the nexus of points there. And the objective of this paper is to propose an agenda for cooperation to the US on a number of issues, which are specific to our bilateral relationship, but also it says very clearly in there that together the EU and the US should seek to find common solutions with other like-minded partners to the problems that are facing us. So this is not a proposal exclusively for the EU and US to work on the problems that we may have or the solutions we can work together and so on. It's talking about areas where we are converging, like on, there's a lot of common ground between our policy on AI. We both had a consultation this year. We're both talking about the importance of a pro-innovation agenda and so on. So on a lot of these issues, the EU and the US have a lot of common ground. And if you look, I think this afternoon will be the first multi-stakeholder plenary of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, GPI as it's called, which originally was a Franco-Canadian initiative, which now has a lot of other members, quite a few member states, other people from around the world, like-minded partners, looking at how we can share best practice and move practice on in terms of a human-centric use of artificial intelligence. So that's a forum where we're definitely working together. The Secretariat of GPI is at the OECD, where we work very closely with all the like-minded partners on digital issues. There's a lot of work going on in the OECD, not just great analytical work, but also policy advice and so on, where we are looking at lots of issues, including data, including AI, blockchain, and so on. So there's a lot of work that goes on together with like-minded partners. A lot of my work is spent organizing dialogues between the EU and other partners. We just recently had our first dialogue with Korea. Went very well. We talked about a lot of common areas of common interest. We had discussions a couple of weeks ago with Japan. We'll be having our next dialogues with Japan very soon, both with the MIIT and with METI, the industrial colleagues. We'll be having soon also dialogues with Taiwan, with China. We had one earlier this year with India. We're looking for another one with Brazil. So we spend a lot of time in dialogues with colleagues, with like-minded partners, trying to see where we can cooperate on issues like maybe joint research on quantum technologies or cooperation on 6G research and all these things. So absolutely, bilateral issues are important, but I think working together with like-minded partners to see how we can find common solutions is an increasing part of our relationship. We had a first dialogue with Australia earlier this year as well. And we see a lot of common areas where we could work together. So it's increasingly a focus of our work. As Reinhard said, it's not just about working bilaterally, but also looking at how we can find common solutions to common problems with like-minded partners.
Thank you. Reinhard, did you want to add to that?
Just a little. I would like to emphasize that in this cooperation, which David just described in different examples, we should be terribly careful to avoid choosing too narrow an approach. Let me exemplify that with the D10 idea. Talking to some friends from Sweden and Finland, they asked me, well, where do we figure in the D10? And Sweden and Finland are the homes of Nokia and Ericsson, so two of the important European players when it comes to digital competency. And if even Finland and Sweden feel that they might be in danger of being left out, then you can imagine how much more other partners might feel forgotten. And we, at almost any cost, we must avoid forgetting the global South. I mean, strategically speaking, what if we on one hand succeed in making sure that our 5G networks will not be built on the basis of high-risk provider technology, but that technology reigns supreme in Africa and the rest of the global south. Then strategically, we're on the losing end of that race. So this is why I believe we must indeed pursue an open door policy with all the willing partners and try to make sure that we're seen as a partner by them.
Yeah. This, I think, very much relates to another question that was raised in the chat. Ingrid de Hoop, if you're still here, I'd like to give you the floor to pose your question directly. Perhaps Brigitte can have a first go at answering it. Ingrid, of course, needs to be given the floor. Otherwise, again, I will raise the question myself. She was basically saying that Europe is investing very much in digital connectivity, but with bilateral partners, developed like-minded partners, whereas China is very much active also in the global south, in its own neighborhood, ground zero, Southeast Asia, if you will. And should Europe also be more active in those countries, which are also, of course, increasingly more markets, e-economy markets? Brigitte?
Yes. First, going back to your previous question, I think I want to add one little thing there, and that's when you're looking at the regulation, business and infrastructure angle, I think we can also focus on doing specific parts with specific countries. Japan, of course, a great example of a country that really is like-minded in every domain. But for example, India is much more alike in the business domain with platform economy regulation, but also dealing with digital financial inclusion, digital payments, while, for example, South Korea is really into the GDPR and wanting to cooperate with the EU on that. So also kind of picking your bilateral connections per subject instead of really wanting to have it all in one package. Then on the question of Ingrid, totally agree also with what Ryan said earlier. And I think that is where digital official development assistance comes in. Referring back to a paper of Maaike, I think digital ODA is really a crucial part in the future, and it entails the technical assistance to developing countries and emerging economies, really to help them address the digital challenges that developed countries face. The digital divide, really trying to get people online, as we here in Western Europe see that everyone really switched online relatively easily. We see big divides in the world now coming from the COVID-19 crisis in the digital respect. And I think including digital ODA could assist countries also to establish data protection structures, prevent cybercrimes, cross-border e-commerce and data transfer rules. And in doing so, the EU can also promote its inclusive and human-centered and open information and communication technology environment instead of the ones that China is now pushing forward, in which we, the connectivity strategy, want to set an alternative for that. Because I have to say, China is responding to a real need in Africa and also in parts of Asia by giving them the tools to work on the digital infrastructure, and by teaming up with countries such as India, who have a large experience with getting people out of the digital divide into the digital world. I think it will be really helpful for the European Union to cooperate and learn from such partners. I'm really wondering how Ryan sees this. I see him nodding quite a lot. So.
Yeah, I'm nodding. And I just want to compliment you for your work. And we have taken the concept, Maaike's concept of digital ODA on board, trying to promote that also in our work.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's good to see that what we're doing is actually having a real effect, stimulating people's thoughts. And of course, we also appreciate the counter arguments. Another question, let me try one more time to get one of our participants in the Zoom session on board. They cannot all see each other. That's the way that the settings have been arranged for this specific webinar. But Inge, you can now perhaps give the floor to Reint Martens, who posed a question in the chat. And if he can unmute himself and pose his own question, I think that will be extremely interesting. Reint, are you there? Sometimes people leave questions in the chat and then perhaps go take a coffee. That might be the case now again. So let me again pose the question. It was basically about a trade-off that, for example, strict regulation that prioritizes individuals' interests or consumer interests, such as data protection regulation, comes with a trade-off for innovation, business innovation that may be hampered, especially from small and medium-sized enterprises. So don't we fear that protecting the European market will slow down innovation? That was basically the way he put it. Who may I give the floor to address that one?
Maybe I could respond to that also in relation to the previous question, because we shouldn't forget that most digital infrastructure is built by private companies for competitive in a competitive environment. And when we talk about Africa, for example, one of the biggest projects that's being prepared right now, the To Africa submarine cable, is a plan to go all the way around Africa, submarine cable going all the way around Africa from Europe through Suez and so on, linking Europe, Western Europe, all the way around Africa through to the Mediterranean and so on. And we talk about Nokia and Ericsson a lot, but this is a project that's planned to be built by Alcatel Submarine Systems, which is the biggest provider of submarine cables in the world. So when we shouldn't think that Europe doesn't have world-beating companies in infrastructure. It certainly does. And Alcatel are also building the cable right now, I think, in Canterbury. For the Bella cable, which is going to be launched next year and to link Portugal and Brazil. So we'll have a direct cable between Europe and Latin America, partly funded by the EU, to link up all of our research and innovation networks in Europe and Latin America. So researchers in Brazil or in Buenos Aires or in Santiago de Chile are basically working next door to researchers in Madrid or Warsaw through the Géant network. And this is an enormous contribution to the type of innovation that we're talking about, because of course all science these days is data to one or other extent. Some of it is heavier in data, like astronomy data and so on, but cooperation using the Géant network is an enormous contribution to science and research within Europe, but also externally as well. And the Bella cable will be finished and launched next year during the Portuguese presidency. And as Reinhard said, I think the Portuguese presidency planned to give a real priority to the very points you made about pushing for more connectivity between Europe and Africa and Latin America, because the growth markets in the future, where it's clear where it's going to be. I think the digital economy in Africa is growing as fast as, if not faster than, the digital economy in Europe. There's lots of entrepreneurs in Africa who want to work with entrepreneurs in Europe and so on, and increasing data flows between us will be really important. So this type of submarine networks, but also across the Mediterranean, are going to be really important. And there's a commercial case for a lot of these. And European companies are winning those commercial battles as well. And what we're trying to do, of course, is to trying to see, look ahead where the demand might be and see whether there's a case for European support for these things.
Thank you. Brigitte, you wanted to add to that?
Yes, If you just ask me this question plainly, then I think, yes, it will slow down innovation. And also if you talk about partners, for example, Taiwanese partners, their companies really see the GDPR, for example, as a hurdle to get into the EU market. But I also think we need to look at the bigger picture here. GDPR is not per se in the interest of companies, of course. They can't innovate as fast as they might like and not use as much big of data sets as they might want to use or see competitors all around the world use. But so is a carbon neutral Europe in 2050 is also not per se in the interest of companies. I think we really need to have a narrative to explain why data protection is necessary and on which conditions data can be shared among trusted partners. Japan took, of course, the initiative to the data free flow with trust, and moving from a motive on why you want to protect data, the EU and its partners can select the necessary tools and get the partners on board to build a more trusted and secure cyberspace.
Yes, but then Reinhard.
Just following up on what Brigitte just said, I would draw exactly the same parallel that she just described. And I would push back against the argument that we have to choose between material interests and post-materialist values. I would rather say that we are addressing concerns today that will form the basis for sustainable business models tomorrow. And if we invest, and innovation is not just a one-dimension development. Innovation is always a choice between different trajectories. And we're not slower because we choose a different trajectory. We might be developing a more sustainable trajectory if we combine our values and new business models.
So we have to look past what's happening today and tomorrow and to the longer, thinking the longer term. That's a very good point. Another question that was raised goes back to funding, David. How optimistic does each of you, I suppose, feel about Europe's ability to unlock sufficient funding to compete with China? Was the question that was put in the chat. Of course, David, you just mentioned big numbers, very substantial. We still have to see the MFF, of course, adopted. But then again, to what extent, for example, some connectivity initiatives of the Japanese or of China, perhaps also, there's sometimes double counting. How much of this is really new? What is it going to add to what we have seen in the past? Perhaps you can offer us just a glimpse of that. And Reinhard, you may reflect on that. I think from your perspective as a European Parliament member, that's your job. And I'm afraid that will have to be the last question we address today.
Thanks very much. And of course, as you say, the budgetary authority, the Council and the Parliament have to decide. So it's up to them. But I think this type of debate shows that everybody understands that digital is important. And we're still waiting, obviously, for the final approval, not of the budget, not only of the budget, but also the financial instruments themselves. But we're confident that the new financial instrument, external instrument, the NDC, so the Neighborhood Development Cooperation Instrument, will include a lot more funding for digital issues than in the previous MFF. Because, of course, if you take yourself back 7 or 8 years when we were discussing the existing financial framework, digital was not as important as it is now. Everybody understands. And I think what's also been important this year is that everybody has realized how important digital is, not just in advanced European or North American economies and so on, but how important digital is everywhere. I mean, Brigitte talked about fintech in India. If you think about M-Pesa, it was invented in Kenya years ago. digital wallets and so on. When you look at the number of financial startups in Nigeria, or the importance of blockchain that people are looking at in Africa for fighting corruption and for improving transparency and so on, and the amount of kids learning on laptops in Peru or in Ghana and so on, everybody realized this is a very important development issue as well. So I think where we are right now in terms of preparing the programming of future instruments shows that digital is important. We're also looking at something we call Team Europe initiatives. And here, what we're trying to do is to develop sort of flagship initiatives that bring together member states, the Commission, EU industry, and so on, in big flagship projects, for example, that might be able to build on the Bella cable. Because of course, if the Bella cable, we have a lovely pipe going from Europe to Latin America, we want a decent pipe at the end of it that goes all the way through Latin America. So the research can go, can bring its benefits throughout Central America, for example. Right? So we're looking at areas like this. And next week we'll be launching what we call the Digital for Development Hub, and this is a project together with the African Union to try to bring together all this expertise and to find solutions to build on the Team Europe approach that we've built up during the COVID response, to see how we can have a much more targeted strategic approach to digital in Africa. So I think we are, if you ask, are we feeling optimistic? Yes, I think so. I think everybody realizes what the issues are. Everybody realizes how digital is essential to meeting sustainable development goals, ensuring we can have a digital post-COVID recovery. So we're fairly optimistic. And I think the point will be not if the resources are there, but if we can make sure that we roll out together in the Team Europe way that we're aiming to.
Thank you. A Digital for Development Hub with Africa. That was new to me. Thanks for that. Reinhard.
Well, let me make two self-critical remarks. I believe we're not coughing up nearly enough investment into the digital transformation in the European budget. We're prioritizing unfairly the defense of the agricultural status quo at the expense of the digital transformation. The European Parliament fought extremely hard in the MFF context and succeeded in getting 4 billion more for Horizon Europe over 7 years. I mean, this shows that the priorities are not really aligned with what we say. We don't walk the talk as we should. And the second self-criticism is that we're doing a lot of good stuff internationally in development cooperation and so on, and not talking about it enough. China give you an expensive credit and they talk about it as if there had been manna raining from heavens. We give people a grant and don't talk about it. And I think that is also something we have to change.
The narratives, yes, definitely important. Which I was so happy to have all three of you with us here this afternoon. And indeed, Reinhard, let me just concur with you. The digital domain, I think, is very much also fighting the vested interests, right? It's a new and upcoming field, and it's, you know, investments are sometimes blocked by vested interests. So we'll have to fight that back. So with that, I have the sort of the lousy job as the moderator to close this very inspiring debate that I trust that we will be able to continue somehow in the next years. This will definitely not go off the agenda. So let me thank again our three speakers, Brigitte Dekker, David Ringrose, Reinhard Bütikofer, for being with us here today. And thanks, of course, also to all of you participants in our Zoom session and on YouTube. Let me call to your attention also our next Clingendael event, which may be of interest for participants today, next Thursday on transatlantic relations. Together with the Brookings Institution in Washington, we will be speaking then about transatlantic cooperation, focusing again on China, but also climate change and European security. And of course, you can still register for this on our website. So rest me to wish you a lovely end of the day, however short or long that might be, depending on where you are. And we look forward to continue the discussion on China's digital Silk Road and Europe's digital decade with you at a later moment. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Maaike.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.